I had been on the road since early morning, pushing myself further than I should have. The kind of drive that makes your eyes burn and your legs feel stiff from sitting in the same position for too long. The desert has a way of draining you without you realizing it. The sun beats down all day. The horizon never seems to change, and the more miles you cover, the more endless it feels. By the time the sun began dipping behind the jagged rocks and the sky turned a dull orange, I knew I couldn't keep going. My body was telling me to stop, but more than that, there was something about that stretch of highway that made me uneasy, like it wasn't safe to be driving alone once the night fully settled. I had passed miles of dry brush, sand, and scattered rocks when I finally saw a glow in the distance. A flickering neon sign, buzzing weakly against the darkening sky. It advertised a motel, though most of the letters were burnt out or barely hanging on. The sign stood at the edge of a dirt driveway that led to a small building sitting far back from the road. I slowed down and pulled in, my headlights sweeping across an empty parking lot with only 2 cars, both of them covered in dust, like they hadn't been moved in days. The motel itself was one long, low building, with about 10 doors all lined up in a row. A single light above the office buzzed, drawing a halo of moths around it. The building looked like it had been there since the 1960s, unchanged and forgotten. I stepped into the office, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale cigarette smoke layered over years of dust, and something faintly sour, like old carpet that had absorbed too much moisture. The person behind the counter hardly looked up. Their eyes were heavy, their face pale under the fluorescent light. They didn't say much, just slid a key across the counter. The key was attached to one of those old plastic diamond-shaped tags, with a room number written in fading ink. I paid in cash and stepped back out into the cooling desert air, feeling more uneasy than relieved. The room itself was exactly what you would expect from a place like that. The carpet was worn thin, and its stains that told their own stories. The walls were painted a dull beige, with cracks running down from the ceiling. A single bed with a thin quilt sat against one wall, and a lamp on the nightstand flickered when I turned it on, casting a weak yellow glow that barely touched the corners of the room. A small air conditioner rattled in the window, blowing out air that smelled like dust. I locked the door, checked it twice, and placed my bag on the chair. I told myself I just needed a few hours of rest. The silence of the desert pressed in from outside, heavy and complete. It was the kind of silence that makes you hear your own heartbeat, the kind that makes even the smallest sound feel too loud. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The hum of the air conditioner was the only thing keeping me company, a low constant sound that almost lulled me to sleep. But sometime past midnight, I woke suddenly, my body tense and alert, as if something had called me out of sleep. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the lamp, and the air conditioner had stopped working. The silence was sharp now, so sharp it hurt my ears. That's when I heard it. The sound of the door handle moving, not fast, not loud, but slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had locked the door, checked it twice, and yet the handle turned as though someone was testing it from the outside. I sat frozen on the bed, my body refusing to move. The sound stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe it had been a trick of my imagination. But then came something worse. A sound so soft I almost missed it. Breathing. Heavy, steady breathing. Right outside the door. Slow inhales and exhales. The kind of sound that told me whoever, or whatever, had been standing there for a long time, just listening. I couldn't bring myself to get up. I stayed there, staring at the door, my pulse racing. Shadows shifted faintly across the narrow strip of light under the door, as if something was blocking it. Minutes felt like hours. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the silence returned. I waited, sitting there in the stale heat of the room, my skin damp with sweat, too terrified to close my eyes. When I finally gathered the courage, I crept to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the lock. It was still in place, but it felt loose, like it had been half-turned. I pressed it firmly back into position and stepped away, my body trembling. The rest of the night stretched endlessly. Every creak of the old building made me jump. Every gust of wind against the walls sounded like footsteps moving past my door. I never slept again, just sat there with the lamp on, waiting for the first light of morning. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. The desert air was cold, and the light revealed something that made my blood run colder. The parking lot was empty. No cars, no signs of life. Nothing but dust stretching across cracked pavement. The office was locked, the blinds drawn, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I left quickly, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt. I never looked back at that motel, and I never took that stretch of road again. To this day, I still wonder who, or what, stood outside that door, breathing in the silence of the desert night. Driving long distances at night had always been part of my life. The open road, the hum of the engine, the sight of headlights stretching out ahead into darkness. It was routine, something I had gotten used to. But even for someone like me, the desert roads in Nevada held a different kind of weight. They were endless, empty, and unforgiving. On that particular night, I had been driving for hours without seeing another vehicle, without passing a single gas station, house, or town. Just miles and miles of black road, cutting through a desert that seemed to go on forever. The clock on the dashboard read just after midnight. The sky above was completely black, no moon, no stars visible, as if the desert had swallowed the light. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel ahead of me, and beyond there was nothing but shadows. I told myself to keep focused, to get through until morning, but the silence and emptiness pressed down hard. That was when I saw it. Far ahead, standing on the shoulder of the road, was a figure. My first thought was that it was a hitchhiker, someone stranded in the middle of nowhere. I slowed slightly, tried to make out details, but the figure didn't move. As my headlights washed over it, I saw clearly. A tall figure standing perfectly still, facing the road, not signaling, not stepping back, not reacting at all. It was as though it had been waiting. I passed it, keeping my eyes forward, and told myself not to look back. But the urge was too strong. In the rearview mirror, I saw it still there, standing exactly as it had been, not moving an inch. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to keep driving. The desert played tricks on people, I reminded myself. It was probably just someone who had wandered too far, maybe drunk, maybe lost. An hour later, the road still empty, the silence inside the truck like a weight on my chest. I saw it again. The same figure, same posture, same distance from the road. I gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of me. No side roads, no cars, no place to hide. Yet there it was, waiting as if it knew I would be coming. I didn't slow this time. My foot pressed down harder on the gas, my eyes locked forward. I told myself not to look in the mirror, not to confirm what I already feared, but I felt it anyway. The presence lingering behind me, the memory of its stillness burned into my mind. The night stretched on, each mile heavier than the last. The desert seemed endless, the road repeating itself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. My chest felt tight, my throat dry. Every shadow on the side of the road seemed like it might take shape. Every mile marker seemed too far from the last. When I saw it the third time, my blood ran cold. It wasn't standing on the side anymore. It was in the middle of the road, directly in my lane. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming against the pavement, the truck shuddering as it came to a stop. My heart pounded, so hard I thought I would faint. But when the headlights settled on the dark stretch of asphalt ahead, the road was empty. There was nothing there. I sat in the cab for what felt like hours, shaking, staring out at the void ahead. My body refused to move. The silence pressed in heavier now, like the desert itself was watching. When I finally forced myself to keep driving, every part of me was on edge. My hands shook on the wheel. My eyes darted to every patch of shadow along the road, certain it would appear again. When I reached the next town just before dawn, I pulled into the first gas station I saw. I sat in the lot for nearly an hour, too scared to get out, too scared to keep going. The light of day did little to calm me. Even now, years later, when I drive those long empty highways at night, I find myself scanning the road ahead, waiting for that still figure to appear in the beam of my headlights once again. It was the first time in my life I had ever agreed to spend more than a few days alone in the middle of nowhere. The cabin didn't belong to me. A distant relative had asked if I could watch over it for a week while they were away, mostly to keep an eye on the pipes, the generator, and to make sure animals didn't get inside. The place was in Oregon, deep among tall pine forests that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The drive there had already set the mood. Once I left the nearest small town behind, the road narrowed into cracked pavement, then to gravel, and finally into a winding dirt trail that seemed endless. The trees stood close together, so tall that even in daylight the road felt dim. By the time I reached the cabin, my phone had already lost service. I told myself it would be good for me, a chance to disconnect and breathe fresh mountain air. But the truth is that the silence unsettled me almost immediately. The cabin itself looked simple from the outside. A single-story wooden structure with a sagging porch, a chimney that hadn't seen use in years, and a tin roof that rattled softly whenever the wind moved through the trees. It sat in a small clearing, the forest pressing close on all sides. No neighbors, no passing cars, nothing but woods that seemed to whisper with every breeze. Inside, it was just as plain. One large room with a wood stove in the corner, an old rug covering part of the floor, and a bed pushed against the far wall. There was no television, no radio, no internet, just the quiet of the woods. I unpacked, told myself I would get used to the isolation, and settled in. The first night was uneventful. I cooked something simple on the stove and sat on the porch until it grew too cold. The forest at night was overwhelming. Every rustle in the underbrush made me tense. Every snap of a branch sounded too close. By the time I went inside and locked the door, I already felt as if the trees themselves were leaning in, watching me. On the second night, I noticed something strange. I had been reading by lantern light when I felt it. A prickling on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I tried to ignore it at first, but then I heard something faint outside. Not the usual sounds of animals moving through the brush, not the distant hoot of an owl, but something heavier, a deliberate crunch of footsteps on pine needles. I froze, listening. The sound came again, closer this time, moving slowly around the cabin. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it could just be a deer or maybe even a bear. I forced myself not to panic. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting for the sound to stop. Eventually it did, and I managed to doze off, though uneasily. The third night was worse. I had just finished eating when I decided to step out onto the porch. The moon was high, casting pale light through the trees. At first everything seemed normal, but then I noticed it. Between the trunks, at the edge of the clearing, something stood. I couldn't make out details, just a darker shape among the darkness, tall, still, unmoving. My throat tightened, my body frozen. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shape was gone. I told myself it had been a trick of the light, a shadow from the trees. I locked the door tighter that night, checked it 3 times, and kept the lantern burning until morning. From then on, the nights became unbearable. I would hear it nearly every evening, the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps moving just beyond the walls, circling, pausing, then continuing. Sometimes I swore I heard breathing outside the window, slow and steady, too heavy to belong to an animal. I stopped stepping out onto the porch. I stopped turning off the lantern. On the 6th night, just before dawn, I finally saw it clearly. I had dozed off in the chair when a noise woke me, a scrape against the window. I turned, hard in my throat, and there it was, a face, pale and expressionless, pressed against the glass. Its eyes locked on mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The clearing was empty, the trees silent. When morning came, I didn't pack slowly. I grabbed my things, left the cabin unlocked, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what was in those woods, or why it came closer each night, but I know I was not alone out there, and I will never set foot in that cabin again. Photography had always been a hobby of mine. I liked capturing forgotten places, old structures, things people had left behind. There was something fascinating about ruins, the way time slowly erases human presence, leaving behind only traces of what once was. That was what drew me to the old farmhouse in Kansas. I had been driving through the countryside, stopping whenever I saw something worth photographing, when I noticed it sitting in the middle of an overgrown field. The roof sagged, the paint peeled, and the windows gaped like empty eyes. A line of trees stood behind it, their branches twisted as though trying to reclaim the building. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled over, grabbed my camera, and made my way through the tall grass. The air was heavy with the smell of earth and weeds, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the field. As I got closer, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects buzzing, just stillness. The kind of silence that makes you feel unwelcome. The front door hung open on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. The floor creaked under my weight as I stepped carefully from room to room. Broken furniture lay scattered, wallpaper peeled in long strips, and glass crunched beneath my boots. The farmhouse was empty of life, but not of presence. Every corner felt heavy, as though the walls remembered too much. I spent hours taking pictures, lost in the way light filtered through broken windows, how shadows stretched across the floor. I didn't notice the sun sinking lower until the rooms grew darker. When I stepped back outside, sky was already painted with streaks of red and purple. That was when I realized something that made my stomach drop. My car wouldn't start. I tried the ignition over and over, but the engine refused to catch. The nearest town was miles away, and I had no signal on my phone. The field stretched empty in all directions. The only shelter for the night was the farmhouse itself. I didn't want to stay, but I had no choice. I went back inside, choosing a corner of the living room where I could sit with my back against the wall. The house groaned in the wind, the old wood shifting with each gust. I told myself it was just the building settling, but as the night grew darker, the sounds became stranger. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the upstairs floorboards. My body froze. I stared at the ceiling, heart racing, but the sound stopped before I could convince myself it was real. Minutes later, it started again, closer this time, as though whoever, or whatever, was upstairs was moving toward the staircase. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped once more, but the silence that followed felt worse. It was as if something was waiting, listening. Hours passed like that, with the occasional creak, the faint scrape of movement above me. I didn't dare leave the corner. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke suddenly to the sound of something far closer. A faint tapping. When I opened my eyes, I saw the window across the room. Something was on the other side, fingers pale against the glass, tapping slowly, rhythmically. I couldn't bring myself to move. I stared as the tapping continued, soft but steady, until finally it stopped. The window was empty again, and the silence returned. When morning finally came, I stumbled outside, desperate for daylight. My car started on the first try, as though nothing had been wrong the night before. I didn't wait to question it. I drove away as fast as I could, the farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. I never developed the photos from that night. I couldn't bring myself to look, because deep down, I knew what I would see. Something standing in the shadows, watching me as I wandered through that forgotten house, waiting for me to stay. I never thought working nights in a hospital would leave such a mark on me. Most people imagine hospitals as places full of noise and activity, but during the graveyard shift, they are nothing like that. Once visiting hours are over and the day staff goes home, the building changes. The hallways become empty. The fluorescent lights hum louder, and every sound echoes. My job was janitorial, and I often had to cover the old basement wing. Most people avoided that area. It wasn't in use anymore, but it was still part of the building, and that meant it still needed attention. The hospital itself was old, built sometime in the 1930s, with additions tacked on over the years. The basement felt like it belonged to another era entirely. The walls were painted in faded green, cracked in places where moisture had seeped in. The ceilings were low, the air damp, carrying the faint smell of mold mixed with disinfectant. Rows of doors lined the corridor, each leading into small, empty rooms. Most had been used for storage before, but now they stood bare. I usually worked with headphones in, letting music carry me through the night. But in the basement, I never did. The silence was different down there. Heavy. If I covered it up, I felt like I had missed something important. So I worked in silence, pushing my mop bucket along, wiping floors, and telling myself I'd finish quickly. One night, I went down around 2 in the morning. The halls upstairs had been quiet, but as soon as I stepped into the basement, a weight settled on me. The lights flickered when I turned them on, buzzing faintly, casting long shadows down the corridor. The building groaned occasionally, the way old structures do, but each sound made my heart skip. I started at the far end, working my way back toward the elevator. At first, nothing was unusual, just the sound of the mops sliding across the floor and the occasional drip of water from the pipes above. But then I heard it, a door clicking shut. I froze, mop in hand, staring down the corridor. All the doors had been open when I started, and I hadn't seen anyone come down. The sound echoed softly, lingering in the silence. I tried to convince myself it was just air pressure or the building shifting, but deep down, I didn't believe it. I forced myself to keep working, though my hands shook. Minutes later, I heard another sound. Soft footsteps, faint but unmistakable. They echoed behind me, at the far end of the hall. I spun around, but the corridor was empty. The footsteps came again, closer this time. My chest tightened, and I felt sweat trickle down my back. Slowly, I backed toward the elevator, pushing the bucket in front of me. I didn't want to turn my back on the hallway, Didn't want to give whatever was there the chance to move unseen. Just as I reached the elevator doors, I heard something worse. Breathing. Heavy, uneven breathing, coming from one of the rooms nearby. My body went cold. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sound was too close, just beyond the doorway. I hit the elevator button over and over, my finger jabbing the panel, desperate for it to open. Behind me, the breathing grew louder, closer, and then the light above the elevator flickered once, twice, before the door slid open. I stumbled inside, leaving the mop and bucket behind, and slammed the button for the main floor. The ride up felt endless. I pressed myself against the wall, my ears straining for any sound. For a moment, I swore I heard something scraping against the elevator doors, like fingernails dragging along the metal. When I finally stepped out onto the main floor, the building looked different, warmer, brighter, full of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something from the basement had watched me leave, something that had wanted me to stay. After that night, I avoided basement shifts whenever I could. Sometimes I still had no choice, but I never went down alone again. And even now, years later, I can't forget the sound of that breathing, slow and deliberate, waiting in the dark. There's nothing quite like being stranded on a winter road. The cold is sharper, the silence heavier, and every minute feels like it steals something from you. I learned that the hard way one night in Minnesota, driving alone during a snowstorm. The roads had been bad from the start, but I thought I could handle it. The snow came down thick, swirling in the beams of my headlights, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The wind pushed against the car, howling across the empty fields. I had been on the highway earlier, but I took an exit onto a smaller road, thinking it would be faster. That was my mistake. Miles later, my car sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried the ignition again and again, but the engine refused to start. The snow thickened, covering the windshield, muffling the world outside. My phone had no signal. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how far the next town was. I sat there for a while, trying to decide what to do. The cold crept in quickly, numbing my fingers. That was when I saw it, a shape through the snow, farther down the road. At first, I thought it was another car, maybe someone who could help. But as I squinted, I realized it wasn't. It was a house, an old one, sitting just off the road, its windows dark. Relief washed over me. Shelter was better than freezing in my car. I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the storm, the wind cutting through my coat, snow crunching under my boots. The walk was short but brutal, each step slower as the cold bit deeper into me. By the time I reached the porch, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely knock. No one answered. The house looked abandoned, its paint peeling, the roof sagging under the weight of snow. But the door creaked open easily, and I stepped inside. The air was stale but warmer than outside. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved through the front room. Dust covered everything, furniture draped in sheets, windows frosted over. I told myself it was enough. I would wait out the storm, maybe build a small fire if I could find wood. But as I explored, I began to notice small things that made me uneasy. A chair pulled away from the table, as if someone had just risen from it. A set of footprints in the dust, not old, but fresh, leading deeper into the house. My stomach tightened. I tried to convince myself they were mine, but the size was different, larger. I followed them with my eyes, and they disappeared into a dark hallway. The storm howled outside, rattling the windows, but the silence inside the house felt heavier. I decided to stay near the front room, not daring to go farther. I huddled in my coat, trying to ignore the creaks and groans of the building. But as the night deepened, I began to hear more. Footsteps, Slow, measured, coming from the hallway. They didn't rush, didn't stumble. They moved with purpose, as if whoever made them already knew I was there. I stayed perfectly still, my breath shallow. The footsteps stopped, but I could feel the presence nearby. Watching, waiting. Hours passed like that. Each minute stretched thin with fear. At some point, exhaustion pulled at me, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke, it was to the sound of breathing, not my own. Heavy, steady breathing, close enough that I could feel it on my skin. I opened my eyes slowly, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, the pale light of dawn creeping through frosted windows. I didn't wait. I left the house immediately, running through the snow back to my car. The storm had calmed, and by some miracle, the engine started on the first try. As I drove away, I looked back once. The house stood there in the pale morning light, silent, empty. But I knew I hadn't been alone in it. Even now, I avoid back roads in winter, because I know what waits in the abandoned houses that still stand in the middle of nowhere, and I know they're not always empty. I used to work security at a freight train yard in Ohio, the kind of place most people only see from a distance while driving by. To me, though, it was more than just a job. It was long nights, endless rows of tracks, and the sound of steel groaning under the weight of cars that never seemed to stop moving. The train yard stretched for miles, a maze of engines, boxcars, and tracks that twisted into the distance. During the day it was loud and chaotic, workers shouting, engines roaring, machines clanging. But at night, it changed into something else entirely. The silence was broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing freight train and the faint buzz of overhead lights. I usually worked the night shift alone, doing slow rounds across the yard. My flashlight beam would cut across lines of steel wheels and couplers, shadows stretching long between the towering cars. The air always smelled of oil, rust, and wet earth. And in winter, the cold bit through my jacket until my bones ached. Most nights were quiet. I would walk, check gates, and write down numbers. But every now and then, I felt watched. The train yard had corners and blind spots, areas where even my flashlight barely reached. And in those places, I always sensed something moving just beyond sight. One night, I started my shift at 11. The yard was silent, except for the wind whistling through broken fences and the occasional creak of metal shifting. The lights overhead flickered now and then, leaving patches of darkness that made me uneasy. As I walked between two long rows of boxcars, I heard something. At first it was faint, like the sound of gravel crunching underfoot. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I moved again, and after a few steps, it returned. Not my footsteps, someone else's. I swung my flashlight behind me, the beam cutting through the dark, but there was nothing, just rows of steel and shadows. I told myself it was an animal, a stray dog maybe, but deep down I knew better. The footsteps grew bolder as the night wore on, always just behind me, always stopping when I turned. My round slowed, my heart hammering in my chest. I forced myself to keep moving, checking locks and chains, pretending I wasn't afraid. Hours passed, and the cold settled deeper. Around 3 in the morning, I passed a line of old cars that hadn't been moved in years. Their sides were covered in rust, their doors sealed tight. As I walked by, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping between the cars, too tall and too fast to be a person. My throat tightened. I swung my flashlight toward the gap, but the beam only lit empty gravel. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something crouched there waiting. I pressed on, but from then on, every sound in the yard seemed amplified. The groan of metal, The hiss of wind, the snap of distant wires. The footsteps followed me all the way to the small security shack near the entrance. I locked myself inside, heart racing, staring through the glass at the dark yard beyond. Around dawn, I finally stepped back outside. The night had lifted, a pale gray light stretching across the tracks. The yard looked empty, quiet, harmless. But when I walked back toward the row of old cars, I saw something that made me stop cold. Footprints, dozens of them, too many to count. They circled the cars, trailed across the gravel, some leading behind me, some leading ahead. But none of them looked quite right. They were too long, too narrow, the shape of the toes strange, almost clawed. I never worked alone in that yard again, because I know what stalked me that night wasn't human. And sometimes, when I drive past, I still glance toward the rusted cars, half expecting to see a figure standing there, waiting for me to return. I grew up in Kansas, where storms were part of life. The sky could turn dark in minutes, the wind rising, and before long, sirens would wail across the fields. Most families had storm shelters. Ours was an old underground one, built decades ago. A concrete room buried in the ground, reached by a heavy steel door and a short set of steps. As a child, I hated going into it. The air was always damp, the walls sweating with moisture, and the smell of earth hung heavy in the air. Even when my family was with me, I felt uneasy. When the storms passed and we climbed out, I always raced to be first, desperate to feel open sky again. Years later, I returned home as an adult. My parents had passed, the farm mostly abandoned, but I went back to settle things. It was spring, and the storms came as they always had. One night, the siren sounded, and instinct drove me to the old shelter. I grabbed a flashlight and pushed open the heavy steel door. The steps groaned under my weight as I climbed down, and the air hit me, damp, stale, as if no one had been there for years. I set the flashlight on a ledge, its beam cutting across the narrow space, illuminating shelves with old jars and boxes, cobwebs hanging thick in the corners. At first, I felt relief. The storm above raged, the wind howling, rain pounding the ground, but I was safe below. The concrete walls muffled the noise, leaving only a low rumble. But after a while, I noticed something. The air felt wrong, heavier, as if I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just nerves, the old unease returning. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like breathing, from the far corner of the shelter. Slow, steady, not my own. My flashlight flickered once, twice, before steadying. In the beam, I thought I saw movement. A shadow shifting against the wall. Too dark, too solid to be from the light alone. I pressed myself against the door, heart hammering. The breathing continued, deep and deliberate, as though someone stood just out of sight. I considered bolting out into the storm, but the wind above screamed so loudly that I knew I'd be ripped apart by debris. The shelter was safer, or so I told myself. The minutes dragged. The storm roared, but inside, all I could hear was that slow, inhuman breath. It grew louder, closer, until I swore it was right behind me. I refused to turn around, my body locked, my eyes fixed on the steel door, praying for the storm to pass. At some point, exhaustion must have pulled me under, because when I woke, the shelter was silent. The air was lighter, and the storm had moved on. I opened the door slowly, the early morning sky gray and calm. But before I climbed out, I glanced back once. The corner where I had heard the breathing was empty, but the dirt floor told another story. Fresh footprints, deep, heavy, pressed into the soil. Too large to be mine, too deep for anyone who had simply stood there. I left the farm soon after. I never returned to that shelter. Because storms are frightening, yes, but what waits in the dark below ground is something far worse. Years ago, I worked a seasonal job as a fire lookout in the mountains of Montana. It sounded peaceful when I first signed up, living in a small wooden tower above the trees, watching the forest stretch endlessly in every direction, noting smoke or fire if it ever appeared. The pay wasn't much, but the solitude and beauty felt worth it. The Watchtower itself sat high on a ridge, accessible only by a winding dirt road and a steep hike. It was little more than a cabin on stilts, with windows on all sides and a ladder leading up from the ground. Inside, there was a cot, a small desk with a radio, shelves for supplies, and not much else. The place was meant for one person only. The days were calm. I'd wake with the sun, make coffee, scan the endless horizon for any hint of smoke. I filled the hours with books, sketching, and the occasional crackle of radio chatter. The nights, however, were different. When darkness fell, the forest changed. From up in the tower, the trees looked like a restless ocean of black shapes. The wind whistled through branches, and sometimes I heard animals moving below. But there were nights when the sounds didn't match anything I knew. Slow, deliberate movements at the base of the tower, the creak of the ladder, a knock so faint it might have been my imagination. One evening, a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked across the mountains, lightning flashing and illuminating the forest below. The radio was dead from static, leaving me completely alone with the storm. I tried to focus on reading, but every flash of light pulled my eyes to the windows. That was when I saw it. Between lightning strikes, something stood at the base of the tower. A shape, too tall, too still. When the light faded, it was gone. But the next flash revealed it again, closer this time, almost at the ladder. My chest tightened, and I gripped the edge of the desk, unwilling to move. The storm raged for hours. Each burst of lightning showed me that figure again and again, always in a slightly different place. Sometimes at the ladder, sometimes under the stilts, sometimes farther out among the trees, as if circling. It never climbed, never called out. It only waited. When the storm finally broke near dawn, I looked again. The forest was quiet, still, washed clean by rain. Nothing remained below. No footprints in the mud, no broken branches. But that night changed me. I still had weeks left in that tower, and each evening I sat awake, staring into the dark forest, waiting for the next flash of lightning to show me what was out there. It never returned, but I knew it could, and I knew it wanted me to see it. Driving long distances at night has always made me uneasy, but sometimes it couldn't be avoided. One winter, I had to make a trip across several states, and after hours on the highway, exhaustion forced me to pull over at a rest stop. It was 2 a.m. The highway had been empty for miles, and the rest stop looked the same, deserted. A single row of dim lights buzzed above the parking lot, casting weak yellow pools on the cracked pavement. A few vending machines stood by the entrance to the restroom building, their hum the only sound in the still air. I parked under the lights, telling myself I'd only stay for a short nap. I locked the doors, reclined the seat, and closed my eyes. The silence felt too deep, the kind that presses against your ears. Sleep came, but it was restless, broken by the feeling of being watched. At some point, I woke suddenly. The windows were fogged from my breath, and for a moment I couldn't tell what time it was. Then I noticed something. A shape, a figure standing at the far end of the lot, just outside the reach of the light. I sat up, my pulse quickening. The figure didn't move. It only stood there, facing my car. I told myself it was another traveler, maybe stretching their legs. But I hadn't heard another car arrive. Minutes passed. The figure didn't step closer, didn't turn away. It remained fixed, a dark outline against darker trees. I tried to start the car, but the engine sputtered before catching, the sound too loud in the stillness. When I glanced back, the figure was gone. Relief lasted only a moment. A tap came against the back window. Light, delicate. I spun, but the glass was fogged too thickly to see clearly. I wiped it with my sleeve, and the window was empty. I drove off immediately, tires skidding on the worn pavement. The rest stop vanished behind me, swallowed by darkness. My heart slowed only when miles had passed, and no headlights appeared in my mirrors. Even now, when I take long trips, I avoid stopping at empty rest stops at night, because I learned something on that winter road. Some figures aren't travelers. They're waiting, watching, standing just outside the light, until you're too tired to keep moving.